I'll take the fat one. That's what the giant mountain man said when the town laughed. A coal-covered girl sold for $1 like worn-out livestock. Folks thought he was half mad, dragging her up to that lonely cabin on Penance Ridge. But something quiet passed between them, something the town didn't see. Now there's smoke on the horizon, hooves in the dark, and a secret tucked behind those cabin walls that could split the valley wide open. When the bell tolls and the law comes knocking, one question will remain. Why would a man feared by all risk everything for the girl no one wanted? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The spring sun beat down mercilessly on Copperbend's dusty town square. Wooden storefronts cast long shadows across the packed dirt, where a crowd had gathered for the monthly workhouse auction. The townsfolk fanned themselves with folded papers, their faces a mix of boredom and cruel amusement as they sized up the line of girls like cattle at market. Dulcie May kept her eyes fixed on her worn boots, letting her dark hair fall forward to shield her face. Coal dust still clung to her broad shoulders and plain cotton dress despite her best efforts to scrub it away. Around her, the other workhouse girls stood straighter, prettier, and more delicate. Everything she wasn't. Next up, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the square. Mary Beth Collins, 17 years old, good with children and needlework. The bidding started quickly, and within minutes, Mary Beth was claimed by the banker's wife. One by one, the girls were called forward and bid upon. Some went to shopkeepers needing help, others to ranchers' wives wanting kitchen girls. With each successful sale, Dulcie's heart sank lower. She knew what was coming. When she was the only one left, the auctioneer's enthusiasm had drained away entirely. Last one, he drawled. Dulcie May, 19 years old, strong back, used to heavy work. He paused as titters rippled through the crowd. Starting bid at $1. The silence that followed was worse than any mockery. Someone coughed. A few women whispered behind their hands, stealing glances at Dulcie's broad frame and work-roughened hands. The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably. Come now, folks. Surely someone needs a strong pair of hands. 75 cents? More snickers. Dulcie's cheeks burned, but she'd learned long ago not to cry where others could see. The workhouse had taught her that lesson well enough. 50 cents? The auctioneer was growing desperate now. 25? I'll take the fat one. The deep voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. The crowd parted, turning to stare at the massive figure who'd spoken from the back. Dulcie looked up despite herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was the biggest man she'd ever seen. A thick beard covered most of his face, and his buckskin jacket stretched across shoulders that seemed wide as a doorway. His eyes, sharp and clear beneath the brim of his hat, met hers for just a moment before returning to the auctioneer. I said I'll take her. The giant man stepped forward, boots raising small clouds of dust. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, letting it flash in the sunlight before tossing it to the auctioneer. That enough? The auctioneer caught the coin reflexively, his mouth hanging open. Yes, Mr. Cutter, that's fine. The crowd had gone completely silent. Dulcie could feel their stares burning into her as the big man, Cutter, strode forward. Without ceremony, he lifted her into the back of his wagon as easily as if she were a sack of grain. She caught a glimpse of the townspeople's shocked faces before he climbed onto the driver's seat and flicked the reins. The wagon rattled out of town, leaving Copperbend's dust and whispers behind. They traveled in silence as the sun wheeled across the sky, the road growing rougher as they climbed into the mountains. Dulcie held tight to the wagon's side, stealing glances at her new master's broad back. He never turned around, never spoke a word. When dusk painted the sky in purple and gold, they finally stopped before a cabin nestled against the dark bulk of Penance Ridge. It was larger than Dulcie expected, built of solid logs with a neat stone chimney. A small barn stood to one side and she could hear chickens settling in for the night. Cutter helped her down from the wagon, his huge hands surprisingly gentle. He led her to the cabin door, then stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was clean and well kept, with a stone fireplace and solid furniture. A pot of something savory bubbled over the flames. "Your room's through there," he said, pointing to a door off the main room. His voice was as deep as she remembered, but quieter now. "Got it ready this morning." Dulcie stepped tentatively toward the door and peered inside. A real bed with a quilt, a small window with actual glass, even a rag rug on the floor. She turned back to him, confusion written plain on her face. "Rest now," was all he said, ladling some stew into a bowl and setting it on the table. "Been a long day." With that, he stepped outside, leaving Dulcie alone in the warmth of the cabin, staring at the first real meal and real bed she'd seen in years. Through the window, she could see his massive silhouette moving toward the barn, outlined against the deepening mountain twilight. The mountain mist crept through the pines as dawn broke over Pennant's Ridge. Dulcie woke with a start, momentarily confused by the soft bed and warm quilt. Years of workhouse routine had trained her body to rise before the sun, ready for orders and labor. She dressed quickly in her faded work dress, smoothing it as best she could. Through the small window, she could see Ephraim Cutter's broad form already at work, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm against the morning quiet. Split logs formed neat stacks beside the chopping block. Dulcie stood uncertainly in the cabin's main room. No orders had been given, no tasks assigned. The silence felt strange after years of barked commands and strict schedules. The hearth needed sweeping, so she found a broom and set to work, stealing glances out the window at her new master. But Cutter never came in to inspect her work or give direction. When she ventured outside to gather eggs from the chicken coop, he merely nodded from where he worked, then returned to his task. The next day followed the same pattern. Dulcie found herself watching him, trying to anticipate needs that weren't voiced. When she saw him carrying water from the outdoor pump, she grabbed a bucket to help. Without a word, he showed her how to prime the handle just right to get the best flow. His huge hands moved with surprising gentleness as he demonstrated the motion. On the third day, she discovered tools in the lean-to shed, a hoe for the kitchen garden, shears for the sheep that grazed in the upper meadow. Again, Cutter offered quiet guidance when she picked something up, showing her the proper grip or technique but never demanding she use them. The cabin itself surprised her with its orderliness. Besides her room and Cutter's, there was a root cellar dug beneath the floorboards, shelves stocked with preserved foods and dry goods. Everything had its place, from the cooking pots to the stack of split kindling by the hearth. It wasn't the crude bachelor's shelter she'd expected, but a real home, carefully maintained. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Dulcie ladled out 2 bowls of rabbit stew. They ate in their usual silence, broken only by the clink of spoons and the pop of logs in the fireplace. But questions had been building in her mind for days, pressing against the quiet until she couldn't hold them back any longer. "Why me?" The words came out barely above a whisper, but they seemed to fill the room. Cutter set down his spoon, his deep-set eyes meeting hers across the table. "Because you looked done with cruelty." 5 simple words, spoken plainly, but they struck something deep inside her that she'd thought long buried. Tears welled up in her eyes for the first time in years, and she quickly ducked her head, letting her hair fall forward to hide her face. She couldn't remember the last time she'd allowed herself to cry. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Dulcie tossed in her bed until the moon was high, then silently slipped out of the cabin. The spring air held a bite of mountain cold as she made her way to the barn, her feet finding the path by memory despite the darkness. Inside, the barn was quiet except for the soft breathing of Cutter's 2 workhorses. Dulcie moved to a corner where she'd hidden a small crate beneath some loose boards. Her hands trembled as she lifted out a wrapped bundle no bigger than a loaf of bread. Unwrapping the cloth revealed 2 treasures, a tiny wooden rattle, worn smooth from handling, and a baby blanket pieced together from scraps of soft fabric. She ran her fingers over them, these secret pieces of her heart that she'd managed to keep hidden through everything. Standing in the barn's shadows, Dulcie turned toward the distant lights of Copperbend, barely visible through the trees. The weight of guilt pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any load she'd ever carried at the workhouse. Here was Cutter, offering her shelter and kindness without demands, while she kept secrets that could destroy everything. She clutched the baby things to her chest, torn between the urge to run and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where cruelty truly had no home. The mountain morning brought with it the familiar creak of wagon wheels on the trail. Dulcie looked up from where she was hanging linens, her hands freezing on the damp cloth. She knew that sound. Old Bucknell's wagon had a distinctive squeal in its front axle that carried for miles. Her heart began to pound as the wagon emerged from the tree line. Bucknell sat hunched over the reins, his weather-beaten hat pulled low. Beside him on the seat was a covered bundle that made Dulcie's breath catch in her throat. Ephraim stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood quietly, watching as the wagon drew closer to the cabin. "Morning, folks," Bucknell called out, pulling his team to a halt. "Brought something that needs delivering." His kind eyes found Dulcie's, and he gave a slight nod. The bundle moved. "Mama?" A small voice emerged from beneath the blanket. Dulcie ran forward as Bucknell pulled back the cover, revealing a small boy with dark hair and soft copper skin. Clay reached out his arms, his face lighting up with recognition. "My boy," Dulcie sobbed, lifting him from the wagon seat. "My precious boy." She clutched him close, tears streaming down her face as she buried her nose in his hair, breathing in his familiar scent. Clay wrapped his little arms around her neck, completely at ease. "Mama sing?" he asked, patting her wet cheek with a chubby hand. "Yes, baby, Mama will sing for you," she managed through her tears, rocking him gently. Bucknell climbed down from the wagon, his joints creaking almost as much as his vehicle. His expression was grave as he approached Ephraim. "There's trouble stirring," he said in a low voice, though not so low that Dulcie couldn't hear. "Over in Dry Needle, about 3 days west. Someone's posted a bounty, asking after a half-breed toddler." He glanced at Clay, who was now playing with the ends of Dulcie's hair. "Don't know who's behind it, but they're asking pointed questions. Thought you ought to know." Ephraim stood with his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable as stone. After a long moment, he gave a single nod. "He stays," he said, his deep voice firm. "I'll handle it." Bucknell seemed to relax slightly at these words. "Figured you might say that. You always did have a way of handling things, Cutter." He turned to his wagon, pulling out a small cloth sack. "Brought some sugar candy for the little one and some thread if you need any mending done." Dulcie tried to reach for her hidden coin purse, but Ephraim was already pressing silver into the tinker's hand. "Much obliged," he said. "You need rest before heading back." Bucknell shook his head. "Best I move on. Less I know about certain things, the better for all concerned." He tipped his hat to Dulcie and Clay. "God keep you safe, ma'am." They watched the wagon disappear back down the trail, its creaking fading into the mountain quiet. Clay had dozed off against Dulcie's shoulder, tired from his journey. "I should have told you," Dulcie whispered, not daring to look at Ephraim. "About Clay, about everything." "When you were ready," Ephraim replied simply. He gestured toward the cabin. "Best get him settled inside." That evening, as darkness gathered outside the cabin windows, new sounds filled the home. The soft scratch of Ephraim's tools as he worked on an old cradle in the corner, sanding rough spots and tightening loose joints, the creak of Dulcie's rocking chair by the fire, and her voice soft and sweet, singing the hymns she remembered from childhood. "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." Clay drowsed in her lap, his small fingers curled around a piece of sugar candy, his face peaceful in the firelight. The familiar weight of him in her arms made her feel whole again, as if a missing piece of her heart had been returned. A profound sense of peace settled over the cabin, as natural as the darkness settling over the mountains. But beneath it lay something fragile, like thin ice over deep water. Dulcie could feel it in the way her arms tightened protectively around Clay, in the alertness behind Ephraim's quiet work. The cradle took shape under Ephraim's careful hands, each stroke of the sandpaper bringing out the warm glow of the wood. It was a tangible promise of safety, of home, and a declaration that whatever storms were gathering in Dry Needle would have to reckon with the mountain man's resolve to protect what was his. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Ephraim stood by his horse, carefully wrapping Clay in a soft blanket, while Dulcie hovered nearby, her hands twisting her apron. "Please," she whispered, "don't take him down there. The town ain't kind to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Ephraim's large hands were gentle as he settled Clay in front of his saddle. "Boy deserves dignity," he said firmly. "Can't hide him away like he's something shameful." He looked down at Dulcie, his eyes softening. "Trust me." Clay giggled as Ephraim swung into the saddle behind him, tiny hands reaching for the horse's mane. The sight of the massive mountain man cradling the small boy would have been almost comical if the stakes weren't so high. "I'll have him back by noon," Ephraim promised and turned his horse toward town. The morning bustle of Copperbend slowed to a halt as Ephraim rode down Main Street. Women stopped their shopping to stare. Men paused mid-conversation outside the barber shop. Clay, oblivious to the tension, pointed at a dog sleeping in the dust. Ephraim dismounted in front of Whitaker's General Store and Cafe, lifting Clay down with careful hands. The boy stayed close to his leg as they entered the store, bell jingling above the door. Mrs. Whitaker stood frozen behind the counter, her usual cheerful greeting dying on her lips. The handful of customers browsing the shelves grew still. "Morning," Ephraim said, his deep voice filling the silence. He placed one protective hand on Clay's shoulder. "This here's Clay. He's under my protection now." The words were simple, but carried the weight of mountain stone. Sheriff Hawley pushed through the swinging doors drawn by the whispers that had already raced through town. His hand rested near his gun belt as he studied the scene. "Cutter," he said carefully. "This the boy folks been talking about from Dry Needle?" "This is my boy," Ephraim replied evenly. "Any man has questions about that can bring them to me direct." The sheriff's jaw worked. Everyone in the store knew Ephraim's reputation from his Army Scout days, knew the stories of what he could do with that long knife he carried, but they also knew him as a man of his word, who'd never started trouble without cause. "Might be some folks take issue with certain arrangements," Hawley said slowly. "Might be some folks need to mind their own business," Ephraim answered. He looked down at Clay. "Pick yourself a piece of candy, son, then we'll head home to your mama." The tension crackled as Clay carefully selected a stick of horehound from the jar Mrs. Whitaker wordlessly held out. Ephraim placed a coin on the counter, nodded to the sheriff, and led Clay out. The sun was high when they returned to the cabin. Dulcie rushed out to gather Clay in her arms, checking him over as if expecting harm. But the boy just proudly showed her his candy. That afternoon, Preacher Thomas's buggy rattled up the trail. The elderly minister looked troubled as he eased himself down from the seat. "Brother Cutter," he said, gripping his Bible, "need to have words, if you'll spare the time." They sat on the porch while Dulcie took Clay inside for his nap. The preacher spoke quietly about tensions still simmering from the railroad raids 3 winters past, when rogue warriors had burned supply stations and killed settlers. Some wounds hadn't healed. "Town's got a long memory," Thomas warned. "Clay's presence will stir trouble with certain elements." "Then certain elements need their hearts stirred," Ephraim replied. After the preacher left, darkness gathered early, bringing storm clouds from the west. That evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Dulcie finally spoke the truth she'd been holding. "Clay's father was a Navajo scout," she said softly, watching the fire. "There was a raid on the workhouse by a rival band. They set fires." Her hands trembled. "He saved me, got me to safety. I never even knew his name. 9 months later..." She glanced toward the bedroom where Clay slept. Ephraim listened in silence. When she finished, he reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a letter sealed with a feather, worn and yellowed with age. "Never opened it," he said, placing it on the table between them. "Some truths take time to face." The letter lay there like a bridge between past and present, between secrets and understanding, as the storm drew closer across the mountains. Spring settled into the valley like a gentle hand smoothing wrinkles from cloth. The morning frost gave way to tender green shoots, and wildflowers dotted the meadow below Ephraim's cabin. Each dawn brought new bird songs and fresh promise. Dulcie moved with growing confidence around the homestead. Her shoulders, once hunched from years of coal sorting, straightened as she worked alongside Ephraim building the new chicken coop. She handed him nails and held boards steady, learning the satisfaction of creating something lasting. "Like this?" she'd ask, and Ephraim would nod, showing her how to measure twice, cut once. The rhythm of hammer and saw filled their days with purpose. Clay toddled between them, clutching the wooden horse Ephraim had carved. His laughter echoed across the yard as he chased butterflies and played in the clean mountain dirt. Sometimes he'd bring Dulcie pretty rocks or feathers, and she'd tuck them in her apron pocket like treasures. In the evenings, while Dulcie cleaned up after supper, Ephraim would sit by the fire with his carving knife and blocks of pine. Shavings curled at his feet as toys took shape beneath his careful hands. A little wagon, a set of animals, a top that spun true. Clay would watch wide-eyed until sleep claimed him. But peace, like spring itself, proved fragile. Preacher Thomas's buggy appeared again one afternoon, kicking up dust along the trail. The old minister's face was drawn with concern as he eased onto the porch where Ephraim sat whittling. "That letter weighs on my mind, Brother Cutter," Thomas said, settling into the spare chair. "The Lord doesn't give us burdens without purpose. Whatever truth it holds needs facing." Ephraim's knife stilled against the wood. Through the open window, they could hear Dulcie singing to Clay as she folded laundry inside. "Some truths hurt more than help," Ephraim replied quietly. "And some hurts fester worse for hiding," the preacher countered. He stood with a creak of joints. "Read it, brother, before choices get made that can't be unmade." That night, after Dulcie and Clay were asleep, Ephraim sat alone by the dying fire. The letter lay in his broad hands, its seal still intact. The feather, an eagle's, tied with sinew, caught the firelight as he turned it over and over. Finally, with careful fingers, he broke the seal. The paper was thin, covered in neat script. He began to read, "To the one who holds this letter, I am Nalia, widow of John Running Wolf, who served as scout with honor. Our son was born as winter stars filled the sky. We named him Clay, for the sacred earth that gives life. When raiders came, John died protecting his unit. I had to flee with others of our band. In the chaos, Clay was lost. I have searched these 3 years following whispers and promises. The army wives speak kindly of you. They say you are a man of honor who knew my husband. I trust you will help my boy find his way home when the snows melt and paths clear. A mother's heart knows no borders. Clay carries his father's spirit and my prayers. Tell him he is loved. Tell him I am coming. With hope, Nalia." Ephraim folded the letter slowly, his weathered face unreadable in the firelight. Through the wall, he could hear Clay's soft breathing from his cradle, mixed with Dulcie's quiet humming of a hymn. The same week, as spring rains washed the streets of Copperbend, the telegraph at the depot clattered to life. The operator's pencil scratched across paper as the message arrived. "Attention station agent, stop. Land acquisition priority for Western Extension, stop. Agent Jared Flint en route to assess holdings. Stop. Maintain discretion until arrival, stop." The operator read it twice, then folded it carefully. Change was coming to the valley, as surely as spring had come to the mountains. Dawn painted the mountains gold as Ephraim saddled his horse. The letter from Nalia weighed heavy in his coat pocket as he rode down the winding trail toward Copperbend. Something in his gut told him that telegram spelled trouble. The telegraph office sat quiet in the early morning light. Tom Wheeler, the operator, jumped when Ephraim's shadow darkened his doorway. "Mighty early for visitors," Tom said, fingers fidgeting with his pencil. "News travels fast," Ephraim replied, his voice low and steady. "Even up mountain trails." Tom's eyes darted to the stack of papers on his desk. "Can't discuss private messages, Mr. Cutter. You know that. Ain't asking for details, just want to know what kind of storm's brewing." Before Tom could answer, a polished carriage rolled past the window, pulled by matching bay horses. A man in an eastern suit stepped down, his boots gleaming despite the dusty street. Jared Flint had arrived. By mid-morning, Flint had set up court in the hotel dining room. His smooth voice carried through open windows as townsfolk gathered to listen. Progress requires vigilance, he proclaimed, gesturing with a cigar. Can't have certain elements infiltrating good Christian communities. Mixed blood leads to mixed loyalties. We've seen it before. Raiders with inside knowledge, telegraph lines cut, supplies stolen. Sheriff Hawley stood at the back, nodding slowly as Flint spoke of protecting what's rightfully ours and cleansing treasonous influences. Sunday's church social thrummed with whispers. Ladies drew back their skirts when Dulcie passed, clutching Clay's hand. Children who'd played with the boy now turned away at their mother's sharp looks. "Heard that Indian woman's still alive?" one woman hissed behind her fan. "Living wild with them raiders, most like." "And that workhouse girl harboring her spawn," another added. "Ain't natural." Dulcie held her head high, but her fingers trembled as she spooned beans onto Clay's plate. The boy sensed the tension, pressing close to her skirts. That night, while Ephraim was still in town gathering information, heavy boots crunched on the cabin's porch. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the quiet house. "Open up!" Sheriff Hawley's voice carried authority and threat. Dulcie clutched Clay to her chest, backing toward the bedroom. "What do you want?" "Got papers here about that boy. Open this door or we'll break it down." "He's just a baby," Dulcie pleaded. "Please." The door splintered inward as 2 deputies crashed through. Dulcie turned and ran, Clay wailing in her arms. She made it 3 steps before rough hands seized her shoulders, throwing her off balance. She twisted as she fell, protecting Clay from the impact. "Get the boy," Hawley ordered. "No!" Dulcie screamed, clawing at the deputy who tried to pry Clay from her grip. "You can't take him. You can't!" Clay's terrified shrieks filled the cabin as they finally wrenched him away. Dulcie fought like a wild thing, scratching and kicking until Hawley slapped iron cuffs around her wrists. "Resisting a lawful order," he growled. "That's jail time, girl." The deputies were mounting up, Clay bundled in a blanket, when hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Ephraim launched from his saddle, face dark with rage. "Let him go," he commanded, voice deadly quiet. "Law's the law, Cutter," Hawley said, hand on his gun. "Stand down." Instead, Ephraim's fist crashed into the nearest deputy's jaw. The man toppled, and Clay slipped from his grasp. The boy scrambled away into the darkness as the night erupted in violence. Ephraim fought like a grizzly, raw and unstoppable. Bodies slammed against walls, bones cracked, blood sprayed across the dirt. But when the dust settled, 3 deputies had their guns drawn while a 4th held a knife to Dulcie's throat. "Enough!" Hawley shouted. "You're both under arrest. The boy's ward of the court now." Dulcie sobbed as they dragged her toward the wagon. Clay was nowhere to be seen in the darkness. Ephraim stood with blood running down his face, hands clenched in helpless fury as Hawley's men bound him. "Search the woods," the sheriff ordered. "Find that boy." Lanterns bobbed through the trees like fireflies as the search began, but Clay had vanished into the night like a shadow, leaving only the echo of his cries in the cold mountain air. The stone holding room in Copperbend's jail felt colder than any workhouse Dulcie had known. Iron bars cast thin shadows across the dirt floor as morning light crept through the single high window. Her shoulders ached from the rough handling, but the pain in her heart cut deeper. Somewhere out there, Clay was alone and frightened. Word of the night's violence spread through town like wildfire. Women clustered in doorways, whispering behind their hands. Men gathered at the saloon, debating justice and territory rights in low voices. Outside the whitewashed church, Ephraim's massive form paced back and forth like a caged bear. His bruised knuckles told the story of the fight, dried blood still crusting his split fingers. Around noon, Preacher Thomas's boots echoed down the jail corridor. He carried his worn Bible and a tin cup of water. Sheriff Hawley nodded him through without a word. "Miss May," the preacher said softly, passing her the water through the bars. "I've come to pray with you, if you'll allow it." Dulcie took the cup with trembling hands. "They took him, preacher. My little boy's out there alone." "The Lord watches over his lambs," Thomas replied, kneeling beside the cell, "even in the darkest valley." He opened his Bible, pages soft with use. "Shall we pray together?" Dulcie nodded, tears finally breaking free. The preacher's voice rose and fell, speaking of mercy and justice, of comfort for the brokenhearted. his words wrapped around her like a warm blanket. As evening settled over the town, Dulcie's clear voice lifted in song. The hymn her mother had taught her long ago floated through the bars and out into the gathering dusk. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The melody drew Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, who stood listening outside the jail window. Soon the seamstress joined her, then the school teacher. One by one, women gathered in the street, drawn by the pure notes of faith rising from behind those iron bars. Was blind, but now I see. Even the men began to pause in their evening routines. The blacksmith removed his hat. The general store owner stood in his doorway, head bowed. Something in Dulcie's voice reached past prejudice to touch the heart of shared humanity. Meanwhile, Ephraim had mounted his horse before dawn, provisions packed for the hard ride to Fort Endurance. Nalia's letter sat secure in his breast pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. The fort lay 2 days hard riding through mountain passes, but there he'd find both the Indian agent and Jerome Wallace, the lawyer who'd once served Clay's father during his Army Scout days. Dark clouds gathered as Ephraim pushed his horse up steep trails. By midday, the storm broke fierce and sudden. Lightning split the sky as rain turned to stinging sleet. The temperature plummeted, wind howling through the pines like lost souls. Ephraim spotted the old line shack just as his horse began to stumble. The abandoned shelter leaned against the mountainside, its roof mostly intact. He led his mount inside just as thunder cracked overhead. The interior was musty but dry. Ephraim's experienced hands soon had a small fire crackling in the stone hearth. As darkness fell outside, he huddled close to the flames, watching them dance. From his pocket, he drew Clay's wooden rattle, its smooth surface worn from tiny hands. The toy seemed so small in his scarred fingers. Memory took him back to quiet evenings watching Clay play by the hearth while Dulcie hummed at her mending. The boy's laughter, bright as sunshine. The way he'd toddle to Ephraim for a story, climbing fearlessly into his lap. Such a little thing to cause so much fear in grown men's hearts. The storm raged through the night, but Ephraim barely slept. His mind churned with strategies, arguments, appeals to law and conscience. The letter would help, proof of Clay's heritage and his father's service. But would it be enough to overcome generations of mistrust? As the first gray light of dawn crept under the shack's door, Ephraim tucked the rattle away and banked the fire's embers. The storm had passed, leaving crystal air and fresh snow on the heights. Fort Endurance lay another day's ride ahead, and justice couldn't wait. He mounted up, turning his horse's head toward the rising sun and whatever hope it might bring. The gates of Fort Endurance loomed before Ephraim as his weary horse trudged the final steps. 2 days of hard riding had left both mount and rider bone-tired. The fort's wooden walls rose against the morning sky, American flags snapping in the spring wind. At the guardhouse, Ephraim presented his papers. "Need to see Agent Callahan," he said, voice rough from trail dust. "Tell him it's about Nathan Blackhorse's boy." The name opened doors. Within minutes, Ephraim found himself in Callahan's office, a sparse room lined with maps and treaty documents. The Indian agent was a lean man with silver at his temples, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Nathan Blackhorse," Callahan said, studying the letter Ephraim handed him. "Best scout I ever worked with. Saved my life twice during the mountain campaigns." He looked up. "This is his widow's hand. Where did you get this?" Ephraim explained everything. The workhouse girl, the child, the town's fear. Callahan listened, fingers drumming his desk. "Nathan died serving the army," Callahan said finally. "His son has rights under the treaties. We'll draft a declaration." He pulled fresh paper from his drawer. "And I'll testify to his father's service myself." They worked through the afternoon, crafting legal language that would protect Clay under both territorial and tribal law. Jerome Wallace, the fort's lawyer, added his expertise, citing precedents and treaty clauses. Meanwhile, back in Copperbend, Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. The church bell rang across the valley, calling folks to worship. Preacher Thomas stood before his congregation, Bible open to the book of Ezekiel. "We've long misunderstood the sins of Sodom," he began, voice carrying to the back pews. "Scripture tells us their true crime wasn't who they were. It was how they treated the stranger in their midst." He paused, letting the words sink in. They were proud, overfed, and unconcerned, while the poor and needy suffered at their gates. Mrs. Peterson dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. The blacksmith shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even Sheriff Hawley, seated in the back row, looked thoughtful. "When we turn away the innocent," Thomas continued, "when we let fear rule our hearts instead of mercy, we risk God's judgment just as surely as they did." That afternoon, whispers spread through town. Women gathered after service, discussing what they'd heard. By Monday morning, something had shifted in Copper Ben's heart. Mrs. Peterson arrived at the jail carrying a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "For the girl," she told Sheriff Hawley. "It ain't right, her going hungry." Throughout the day, others followed. The seamstress brought a clean dress. The school teacher left books. Even the blacksmith's wife appeared with a pot of stew, muttering that jail food ain't fit for dogs. Dulcie accepted each gift with quiet grace, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The cell remained locked, but the bars seemed less cold somehow. Tuesday morning brought the sound of hoofbeats. Ephraim rode into town, his horse dust-covered and weary. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but he carried himself straight as he dismounted before the jail. Sheriff Hawley met him at the door. "Got papers," Ephraim said simply, producing the documents. "Clay's father was Army. Boys got rights." Hawley studied the declaration, noting the official seals. "There'll need to be a hearing," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, courthouse." Ephraim nodded. "Tell Flint and his railroad men. Everyone should hear the truth." Word spread quickly. A hearing would be held, not just about Clay, but about what kind of town Copper Bend wanted to be. Through her cell window, Dulcie watched people hurrying past, carrying the news. She pressed her hand against the rough stone wall, feeling the warmth of afternoon sun. "We've got a chance now, little one," she whispered, thinking of Clay's sweet face. "Lord willing, we've got a chance." That evening, Preacher Thomas visited again, bringing his Bible and a fresh cup of water. "The law and the prophets both speak of justice," he said softly. "Sometimes God uses both to change hearts." Dulcie nodded, hope blooming like spring flowers after rain. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, she felt the support of the town wrapping around her like a warm quilt, patched together from small kindnesses, stitched with threads of understanding. The converted schoolhouse creaked under the weight of so many bodies. Morning sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across rough wooden floors. Every bench was filled, with townsfolk standing 3 deep along the walls. The judge, borrowed from the circuit court in Silver City, sat behind Miss Peterson's desk, his black robes stark against the classroom's faded maps and charts. Dulcie sat rigid beside Ephraim, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She'd borrowed a clean dress from the minister's wife, but nothing could hide the pallor of her jail-worn face. Clay's absence felt like a physical ache in her chest. Jared Flint took the floor first, his suit dust-free despite the spring winds. "This is nothing but a land grab," he declared, pacing before the judge. "These people are using an innocent child to stake illegal claims. The railroad has prior rights to—" "This hearing concerns a child, Mr. Flint," the judge interrupted. "Not your railway interests." Sheriff Hawley testified next, shifting his hat between calloused hands. "Ain't about the boy himself, Your Honor. It's about order. Can't have folks taking the law into their own hands, harboring—" He paused, glancing at the crowd. "Well, harboring those that ain't their own." The schoolhouse grew stuffier as morning wore on. Children peeked through windows, standing on tiptoes to watch. When Ephraim finally rose, the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He pulled Nalia's letter from his shirt pocket, the paper worn soft at the creases. "If it please the court," he said, his deep voice unusually gentle, "I'd like to read something." The judge nodded. Ephraim unfolded the letter carefully. "To the one who holds this letter," he began, "I write of my son, Clay, born under the spring stars 2 years past." His voice caught slightly. His father, Nathan Blackhorse, died protecting soldiers who'd once been strangers to him. He believed in building bridges between our peoples. The room grew still. Even the children at the windows stopped fidgeting. "I've searched for my boy since the raid scattered our camp," Ephraim continued. "I know he lives. A mother feels such things." His hands trembled slightly. "Nathan died saving my life," he added, looking up from the page. "Pushed me clear of a collapsing wall during the mountain campaign. Never got to thank him." Agent Callahan stood next, ramrod straight in his government suit. "Nathan Blackhorse served with distinction," he testified. "Under treaty law, his child has protected status. The boy's rights are clear." The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "The law must be upheld," he began, "but so must—" The back door creaked open. Sunlight spilled into the schoolhouse, silhouetting a woman in the doorway. She wore a long skirt and leather moccasins, her black hair bound in traditional Navajo style. Road dust coated her clothes, but she stood straight and proud. "Mama!" Clay's voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd. He broke free from Mrs. Peterson's grip and ran to the woman, who scooped him up in one fluid motion. "Nalia," Ephraim breathed. The silence was absolute. Nalia held Clay close, murmuring soft words in Navajo against his hair. Then she stepped forward, facing the judge. "I am Clay's mother," she said clearly, her English precise. "Everything in that letter is true. My husband died serving your army, protecting your people." She met Ephraim's eyes. "Your words honor his memory." Clay squirmed in her arms, reaching toward Dulcie. "Mama," he called again, confusion in his small voice. Nalia studied Dulcie's tear-streaked face. "He already calls her Mama," she said softly. Then, with dignity that stilled every whisper in the room, she added, "We could share that, if she'll stay." Dulcie's hands flew to her mouth. Ephraim's shoulders sagged with relief. Even Sheriff Hawley looked away, blinking hard. The judge cleared his throat. "Well," he said gruffly, "seems we've heard from the one person whose opinion matters most." Clay reached out again, one small hand grasping for Dulcie while the other clung to Nalia's dress. In that gesture lay all the truth the court needed to see. The judge's gavel struck with finality. This court finds no cause for charges against Miss Dulcie May. Furthermore, any bounty concerning the child Clay is hereby nullified. He fixed a stern gaze on Jared Flint. "And sir, you'll leave this district by sundown. We don't cotton to those who'd use children for land schemes." Flint's face darkened, but Sheriff Hawley's hand on his shoulder guided him firmly toward the door. The schoolhouse erupted in relieved chatter, benches scraping as people rose to their feet. Outside, spring sunshine warmed the packed earth. Women hurried home to fetch dishes while men gathered wood for a bonfire. By late afternoon, tables appeared in front of the whitewashed church, groaning under the weight of food from every kitchen in Copperbend. Mrs. Peterson brought her famous apple pies. The Chinese laundryman's wife contributed sweet dumplings. Even crusty old widow Jensen hobbled over with her spiced pickles. The scents of cornbread, roasted chicken, and bubbling stews filled the air. Dulcie stood near the church steps, still dazed by the day's events. She watched Clay chase fireflies in the growing dusk, his laughter pure and free. Nalia approached quietly, her moccasins silent on the packed earth. "He runs like his father," Nalia said softly, "swift and sure-footed." Dulcie twisted her hands in her borrowed dress. "I never meant to keep him from you," she whispered. "That night during the fire he was so small, so afraid. I just wanted him safe." "I know." Nalia's voice held no judgment. "Come, let us talk." She led Dulcie to a quiet spot beneath an old cottonwood tree, away from the festivities. The two women sat on a weathered bench watching Clay play in the deepening twilight. Lanterns began to flicker to life around the feast tables, casting warm pools of light. "I never thought I'd be worthy of being a mother," Dulcie confessed, her voice catching. "Growing up in the workhouse, all anyone ever said was how useless I was. Too big, too slow, too plain." She wiped roughly at her eyes. "But Clay, he looked at me like I was everything." Nalia reached over and took Dulcie's work-roughened hand in her own. "You are more than worthy," she said firmly. You gave him love in my place. When I could not be there, you became his shelter." She squeezed Dulcie's fingers. "That is what makes a mother's heart." Tears spilled down Dulcie's cheeks. In the distance, Ephraim sat on a split-log bench, his big hands moving steadily as he whittled. Wood shavings curled at his feet while he watched the two women with quiet satisfaction. Clay darted between the feast tables, collecting treats from doting townspeople. Every few minutes, he would run back to where Dulcie and Nalia sat, offering them bites of cornbread or pieces of candy. His small face glowed with joy, secure in the love of both his mothers. Preacher Thomas's wife led a group of women in hymn singing, their voices rising sweet and clear in the evening air. Others joined in, until the song swelled under the stars. Even those who couldn't carry a tune hummed along, caught up in the spirit of reconciliation. Sheriff Hawley approached Ephraim hat in hand. "Reckon I owe you an apology," he said gruffly. "Got caught up in fear instead of doing what was right." Ephraim paused in his whittling, studying the small wooden horse taking shape under his knife. "Ain't me needs the apology," he replied quietly, nodding toward Dulcie and Nalia. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, that's true enough." He walked over to the women, his steps heavy with remorse. Children played tag around the bonfire while their parents shared food and conversation. Old grievances began to soften in the face of shared celebration. Mrs. Peterson was deep in discussion with Nalia about different methods of treating fever in little ones. The Chinese laundryman taught Clay how to bow properly, making the boy giggle. Under the cottonwood tree, Dulcie watched it all with wonder. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not as the awkward workhouse girl, but as a mother, a protector, someone of value. Clay ran back to her again, his small arms wrapping around her neck as he planted a sticky kiss on her cheek. "Love you, Mama," he said, then turned to Nalia. "Love you, Shima." He used the Navajo word for mother naturally, bridging his two worlds without effort. The feast continued under the stars, a testament to the power of love over fear, of mercy over judgment. And in that sacred space between firelight and darkness, a new kind of family was born. A week passed like a dream. Spring flowers dotted the meadow grass, and mornings dawned clear and bright. The sound of sawing and hammering echoed across Pennant's Ridge as Ephraim began work on a second cabin just a stone's throw from his own. The new structure would face east, as was proper for Navajo homes. Ephraim had chosen the spot carefully, making sure it had a clear view of both the sunrise and the sacred mountains in the distance. Though smaller than his own cabin, the new building would be sturdy and warm, with plenty of room for Nalia and Clay. Dulcie worked alongside him, her strong shoulders now bronzed by the sun. She'd learned to handle a crosscut saw with skill, matching Ephraim's rhythm as they cut through thick pine beams. The fresh-cut wood released its sweet scent into the air, mixing with the wild sage that grew nearby. "Mind the line," Ephraim reminded her gently as they worked on another beam. His massive hand steadied the timber while Dulcie guided the saw. She nodded, concentrating on keeping the cut straight and true. Clay played nearby, stacking small pieces of wood into precarious towers. Sometimes he would bring them water from the pump, his small face serious with responsibility, as he carefully carried the tin cup between them. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the spring air cooled. Long shadows crept across their work site while the sun sank toward the western ridge. Dulcie paused to wipe sweat from her brow, watching as Clay chased a butterfly through the new foundation posts. "You're good with him," Ephraim said quietly, setting down his hammer. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken these words, but something in his tone made Dulcie look up. She brushed sawdust from her skirts, suddenly uncertain. The past week had been filled with activity, planning the cabin, gathering materials, starting the build. But beneath it all, questions had been growing in her heart. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, watching Clay play. Maybe I should move on once the cabin's done. Let Nalia and Clay have their proper family time." The words hurt to say, but she forced them out. "I don't want to be in the way." Ephraim set down the beam he'd been measuring. The sun had nearly touched the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. His shadow fell long across the newly laid foundation as he turned to face her. "This has become your home," he said simply. His deep voice was gentle but firm. "And mine." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I'd hoped you'd stay." Dulcie's heart quickened. "As what?" she whispered, barely daring to hope. "As family," Ephraim answered. His eyes met hers steadily. "Not as a helper, not as someone who needs protecting, but as yourself. The woman who faced down a whole town to save a child. The woman who sings hymns that make others weep. The woman who's learned to saw straighter than most men I know." Tears pricked at Dulcie's eyes. Without a word, she stepped closer and laid her head against his shoulder. Ephraim remained still, solid as the mountains themselves, while the evening breeze stirred around them. Clay's clear voice broke the moment. "Mama! Uncle Frame! Look!" He held up a twisted piece of wood that, in his imagination, perfectly resembled a horse. "That's fine work, little man," Ephraim rumbled, his voice warm with affection. Later that night, after Clay had been tucked into bed, Ephraim sat alone by lamplight in his workshop. His big hands moved with surprising delicacy as he worked on one of the mantel beams for Nalia's cabin. The knife blade whispered against the wood as he carved, bringing forth the shape of a hawk in flight. The bird emerged slowly from the pine, wings spread wide, every feather detailed with care. It was a tribute to Clay's father, the scout who had died saving others. Ephraim worked until the lamp burned low, making sure each line was perfect. When finished, the hawk seemed almost alive, soaring across the grain of the wood, eternal in its grace. He ran his fingers over the carving one final time, remembering a brave man he'd never properly thanked. Now, in this small way, he could honor that sacrifice. The hawk would watch over Clay and his mothers, a reminder of courage and love that bridged all boundaries. Outside, an owl called softly in the darkness. Inside the cabin, Clay slept peacefully, while Dulcie's quiet humming drifted down from her room. Ephraim smiled slightly, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of building, not just a cabin, but a future none of them had expected to find. Spring settled fully into the valley, painting the slopes with wildflowers and fresh grass. The two cabins stood like steadfast guardians beneath Pennant's Ridge, Ephraim's original homestead, and Nalia's new dwelling, connected by a well-worn path that tiny feet traveled daily. Clay flourished in the care of both households. Each morning he would wake with the sun and toddle between the cabins, certain of welcome at either door. In Nalia's home, the smell of cedar and sage mingled with traditional foods cooking over the hearth. She taught him words in their native tongue, her voice gentle as she helped him form the sounds. "Shiaji," she would say, touching his chest. "My child." Clay would beam and repeat it, his small voice carrying the ancient words of his people. Later, he would rush to Dulcie's kitchen, where the aroma of fresh bread filled the air. She lifted him onto a stool, helping his small hands knead the dough. Flour dusted his copper cheeks as he giggled, proud to help make the daily loaves. "Gentle now," Dulcie would guide him, her own hands strong and sure from practice. "That's the way, just like that." The town of Copperbend chose the first warm Saturday in May to host a spring gathering, welcoming their new neighbors properly. Women brought covered dishes while men set up rough-hewn tables in the meadow near the church. Children darted between adults, clutching toys that bore Ephraim's distinctive carving style. Wooden horses with flowing manes, delicate birds that seemed ready to take flight, and tiny wagons with turning wheels. Clay moved easily among the other children, sharing his toys without hesitation. His laughter joined theirs as they played chase through the grass, all thoughts of difference forgotten in the simple joy of childhood games. Sheriff Hawley stood apart from the crowd, watching the festivities with thoughtful eyes. When Dulcie passed near with a basket of fresh rolls, he stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Miss May," he said quietly, removing his hat, "I owe you words I should have spoken sooner." He paused, clearly uncomfortable, but determined. "I was wrong about many things. The boy, Clay, and you both. I'm sorry for it." Dulcie studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, her voice steady. "Would you care for a roll? They're still warm." This simple offering of bread seemed to seal something between them, a bridge across troubled waters now calm. As evening approached, Preacher Thomas called everyone to gather near the church steps. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, casting long shadows across the assembled faces. "Friends," he announced, his voice carrying across the crowd, "we have a special blessing tonight. Our own Dulcie May has written a hymn, and I believe it speaks to all our hearts." Dulcie stepped forward, her cheeks flushed. The paper in her hands trembled slightly as she began to sing, her clear voice rising pure and strong into the evening air. "Mercy, mercy at Penance Ridge, where broken hearts find healing's bridge. Through storm and strife, through dark of night, love's lamp burns steady, burning bright." Others joined in as she taught them the chorus, voices blending in harmony. Tears flowed freely, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest child, each feeling the weight of truth in the words. Even Sheriff Hawley was seen wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. Clay sat on Nalia's lap, one small hand reaching out to hold Dulcie's skirt. Ephraim stood nearby, his massive frame still as stone as the music washed over them all. As the gathering wound down and families began heading home, Ephraim approached Dulcie. Without ceremony, he handed her a small wooden box, beautifully carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. "Turn the key," he said softly. Dulcie did, and sweet notes began to play, the very melody of her hymn, transformed into delicate chimes. She gasped, touching the smooth wood with trembling fingers. "How did you—" "Been working on it since I first heard you humming the tune," he admitted. "Wanted to capture it proper." The box played on as the last light faded from the sky, its gentle music a testament to change, to healing, to hope made real through mercy's transforming power. Around them, the community that had once scorned difference now celebrated it. Children's laughter echoed across the meadow. Toys were shared without thought of whose hands had held them first, and the smell of different foods from different traditions mingled on the evening breeze. A feast of acceptance, served with open hearts. The warm days lengthened as spring mellowed into early summer. Morning dew sparkled on new-sprouted corn rows, and fresh-cut fence posts stood straight and proud around the expanded pasture. The homestead had grown alongside its unusual family, stretching to embrace all who called it home. One bright Tuesday morning, Ephraim and Dulcie sat at the rough-hewn table in the town lawyer's office. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, catching motes in its beams as they bent over the papers before them. "Sign here," the lawyer indicated, pointing to the bottom of the deed. "And here." Dulcie's hand trembled slightly as she took the pen. She had never owned anything before, not even the clothes on her back during her workhouse days. Now she was about to become half owner of a proper homestead. "You're certain?" she whispered to Ephraim. He nodded, his eyes gentle. "More certain than sunrise." Their signatures flowed across the page, one after the other. Above them, in fresh ink, stood the new name they'd chosen together, Mercy Ridge Homestead. "It's official," the lawyer declared, stamping the document. "The property's registered to both of you now." That same afternoon, old Bucknell's wagon creaked up the trail, bringing mail from the railway station. Among the letters was one addressed to Nalia, bearing marks from her people's territory. Clay bounced excitedly as his mother opened it, recognizing the familiar patterns on the envelope. Nalia's face softened as she read. "They want to meet you properly," she told Clay, touching his cheek. "Your father's clan, they say their hearts are open, waiting to welcome their lost son." Dulcie watched from the doorway, her heart catching, but Nalia looked up and smiled, including her in the moment. "They ask for both mothers to bring him," she added. "They wish to honor the one who protected him when I could not." Plans for the journey began taking shape between the two households. Ephraim marked the safest routes on maps, while the women prepared supplies and discussed what Clay would need. The boy himself could hardly contain his excitement, practicing the Navajo words Nalia taught him with renewed enthusiasm. One morning, as they worked out travel details, a knock came at the cabin door. Miss Henderson, the town's schoolmarm, stood on the porch, her usual stern expression softened by uncertainty. "I've been thinking," she said, addressing both Dulcie and Nalia, who happened to be there, "about the boy's education." She straightened her spine. "When he's old enough for lessons, I'd like to offer my services. We could arrange something suitable." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of past prejudices being set aside. Both women recognized the effort this offer required, how far the teacher had come from her initial cold shoulder when Clay first arrived. "Thank you," Nalia said simply, extending her hand. "We would be honored." Miss Henderson's relief showed in her smile as she shook first Nalia's hand, then Dulcie's. The final thread of healing came on a golden evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose. Ephraim stood on Penance Ridge, looking out over the valley when footsteps crunched on gravel behind him. Preacher Thomas approached, his Bible tucked under one arm. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, watching the light fade. Their shared history, years of distance born from old war wounds and unspoken guilt, seemed to drift away on the evening breeze. "Reckon it's time we laid some ghosts to rest," the preacher said quietly. Ephraim nodded, his massive frame outlined against the sunset. "Reckon so. Shall we pray together, brother?" "Been a while since anyone called me that," Ephraim admitted. But he bowed his head as the preacher began to speak, their voices joining in the ancient words of grace and forgiveness. Below them, smoke rose from both cabin chimneys, carrying the scent of evening meals cooking. Clay's laughter echoed up from the yard where he played. The valley stretched out peaceful and green, dotted with other homesteads and the distant roofs of Copperbend. What had begun as one man's isolated refuge had grown into something larger, a place where mercy flowed as naturally as the spring-fed creek that watered their gardens. Mercy Ridge stood as a testament to healing, not just for one unusual family, but for an entire community learning to see with new eyes and open hearts. The afternoon sun warmed the freshly swept porch boards as Clay arranged his wooden animals in a careful line. Each toy bore the loving marks of Ephraim's knife, a deer with delicate ears, a bear with a rounded snout, a hawk with spread wings. The boy hummed softly, a melody that mixed Dulcie's hymns with Nalia's songs. Ephraim and Dulcie sat side by side in matching chairs he'd crafted over the winter. Their initials, EC and DM, were carved into the headrests, surrounded by a pattern of interwoven vines. The wood had weathered to a rich honey color, marking the passage of peaceful days. Behind them, Nalia's skilled fingers wove through Dulcie's dark hair, creating neat braids that would keep her cool during the coming summer work. The three adults had fallen into an easy rhythm together, their unlikely friendship growing stronger with each passing season. "Hold still now," Nalia murmured as she worked. "Just 2 more plats to go." Dulcie smiled, watching Clay play. "Much obliged. Never did learn to manage it proper myself." "Mama pretty," Clay declared, looking up from his toys. He beamed at both women, his copper-toned face glowing with health and happiness. The sound of hammering drew their attention to where Ephraim stood on a ladder, mounting a freshly carved sign above the cabin's entrance. The wooden board was solid oak, its letters deep cut and filled with dark stain. "Mercy Ridge, all welcome here." Ephraim stepped back to study his work, then descended the ladder with careful movements that belied his size. He joined the others, settling into his chair with a satisfied nod. "Reckon that makes it official," he said quietly. Dulcie reached over and squeezed his hand. "It's been official in our hearts for a good while now." The peaceful moment was interrupted by hoofbeats approaching up the trail. A rider appeared around the bend, young Tommy Watson from the telegraph office, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Mr. Cutter," he called, reining up at the porch steps. "Got news from Fort Endurance." Ephraim rose, his expression concerned. "Catch your breath, boy. What brings you out here in such a hurry?" Tommy pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Agent Callahan sent word. There's a situation up near Broken Spoke Creek. A settlement hit hard by fever. Most folks pulled through, but..." He paused, glancing at Clay. There's a little girl, about 3 years old. Both parents gone. No kin to claim her. A heavy silence fell over the porch. Clay looked up from his toys, sensing the shift in mood. Agent says he remembered how you folks took in the boy here. Tommy continued. Thought maybe. Ephraim turned to Dulcie, their eyes meeting in silent communication. She saw in his face the same pull she felt in her heart, the memory of what it meant to be alone, unwanted, until someone opened their door. Dulcie looked at Nalia, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then back to Ephraim. Her chin lifted with quiet certainty. Yes, she said simply. Ephraim's shoulders relaxed and the ghost of a smile touched his beard. He turned back to Tommy. Tell Agent Callahan we'll come. The child won't sleep alone another night. Clay stood up, gathering his wooden animals. New sister? He asked hopefully. Looks that way, little one, Nalia answered, finishing Dulcie's final braid. Our family's growing again. Above them, the new sign caught the afternoon light, its promise of welcome carved deep and true. Mercy Ridge was ready to open its doors once more. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.